Disability and the U.S. election.
It's been a hot topic ever since Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump mocked a journalist with a disability.
Written by a nice reporter. Now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember. He's going like, I don't remember. Oh, maybe that's what I said. This is 14 years ago. He's still...
It was a watershed moment, and not necessarily a bad one, because suddenly America and the world were talking about what it's like to live with a disability. In the United States, 1 in 6 eligible voters has an intellectual or physical disability, making them a potentially powerful force. I'm Malika Bilal.
And I'm Ahmed Chabuddin, and you're in the stream.
Joining us to talk about the election and the challenges of exercising their right to vote, we have Lawrence Carter Long, a spokesman for the National Council of Disability. In Winsboro, South Carolina, Vilissa Thompson is a writer and disability rights consultant with the group Ramp Your Voice. In San Francisco, California, Alice Wong is the founder of the Disability Visibility Project. She's also one of the creators of the hashtag #CryptTheVote. And in Plattsburgh, New York, Andrew Pollering is a disability rights advocate and co-creator of the #CryptTheVote campaign. Welcome to the stream, all of you. I want to show you a clip of something that really kind of made for a national conversation. Americans with disabilities took center stage after, of course, those comments that Donald Trump made. Here's how the Democratic National Committee capitalized on that controversy. Take a look at one of the season's crowning political events.
This guy, I don't know what I said. I don't remember.
When people make fun of the disabled, I become furious. It is despicable.
He will not apologize and even said that the journalist should stop using his disability to grandstand.
Please welcome Anastasia Somoza from New York.
So disability rights there taking center stage. That was a disability rights advocate who's known Hillary Clinton since she was 9 years old. Vilissa, that was in July. Where have we come since then in this national conversation?
Well, when it comes to Donald Trump specifically, we haven't gone anywhere since he has not addressed any type of policy that relates to disabled people or the ones that disabled people care about. I think that since the DNC, disability has been ramped up with some of the campaign ads that feature disabled people and their families. I do wish that the politician would discuss deeper about the issues that disabled people want to talk about and the issues that matter to all of us, which is every issue. So I really wish that candidates were more engaged with us and getting our input on how our experiences fit into the policies that they want to improve if they become president.
You know, you're talking about politicians. Obviously, that's what we're focusing on. Michelle in New York is saying this, Lawrence. She says to us, politicians are realizing the importance and power of the disability vote, which I don't think has happened before. Some people think it has, some people think it hasn't, that social media played a role. Do you think that this was all caused by Trump?
Disabled voters have always been here. I think with the advent of social media and the use of social media, we can't be ignored anymore. You know, disability used to be a diagnosis. That's all it was. Now it's a community, it's an identity, and a constituency that politicians really have to pay attention to. And I think the changes in technology, bringing community together, has really forced us to see that and forced politicians to see that as well.
Alice, you're nodding your head there.
Yes, I think one of the great things about social media is that there aren't the traditional gatekeepers. You know, we're speaking for ourselves, and we're not waiting around for reporters to take notice, even though it is great to see there in this election, far more, coverage about disability issues and people with disabilities. But yeah, I think social media has been incredibly liberating for people with disabilities and other marginalized communities who never really had a chance to build their own platforms.
So I love that you talk about building your own platforms, because that's a really good segue to a Twitter chat the stream just held with your group. So here's a tweet of what that looked like. We partnered with hashtag #CripTheVote for a Stream Elections Twitter chat on disability and the U.S. election. Andrew, you are part of those who are behind this hashtag #CripTheVote, and I read that this conversation emerged out of a desire to see disability rights issues at the forefront. You weren't seeing that. Can you explain?
Right. Well, the three of us, myself, Alice, and Greg Veritan, who's not with us today, we're having conversations online about the election, I think in January, and there had already been a number of debates and a lot of things had already happened, including Donald Trump's remarks there. But we noticed that there just wasn't any discussion of disability issues, particularly not in the debates. And being somewhat familiar with social media and how it works and how it might work, we came up with the thought of maybe having a couple of chats, particularly around the debates, to see if people might be interested in bringing the issues out ourselves, rather than sort of just waiting for hopefully somebody to ask a question in the debate. And it grew from there.
And obviously, this is a conversation that a lot of people hope continues to grow. With that in mind, I just want to draw your attention to one of the questions. Let me just find it here. We asked question 4, what issues that affect people with disabilities are going unnoticed in the U.S. election? One interesting answer we got right here from EB saying, it's not just issues going unnoticed, it's our reality as a whole. Disabled people aren't individual tragedies. I see that you're nodding, Vilissa. Vilissa, when you hear that, you know, it's that their entire experience. How do you feel? Do you relate to that?
I do, because I think what the tweeter was going towards was the fact that when we hear the disabled stories, it's usually the inspirational pity model. We are not to be pitied. We are not inspirational. We are living our lives, and we are combating ableism, racism, sexism, and realism there is. So I do agree that the issues are not just the sole thing that we care about. We do want to be seen as whole people, and our voices respected as such.
And Vilissa, if I could just quickly get in there, I know you want to get in there. We have another tweet from Michelle in New York City. Because you said ableism, she says people are outraged when Trump mocked the disabled reporter, but aren't always so aware of their own ableism. When you use that term, what does it mean, and what do you make of that? You guys are laughing, but...
Well, I think, and it was reminding me of that clip that you showed, that the people were so outraged, and I'm not doubting their outrage, but it is true that ableism is not just the most outrageous things people say. It's some of the less intense but very ingrained habits that people have around disability.
Like what? Give us an example.
Talking when I'm with another person, if a third party is in the conversation, and instead of talking directly to me, talks to somebody else about me.
Oh gosh.
And in fact, there's a parallel there with politics, that a lot of times what we get, and it's a good thing, believe me, that politicians will talk about us, which is big progress, but not so much to us, right? So we'll talk about the disabled people need this, want that, this is what I'm going to do. But how often do they say, hey, you disabled people, I want you to vote for me, and here's why that would be a good idea.
I think one of the big problems that we see there is often the assumption that anything having to do with disability is just a health issue. So we could be talking about employment, we could be talking about education, we could be talking about transportation. Those aren't thought about as disability issues, but they are. If you can't get the job, if you're finding it more difficult to get to the job, if you can't get an education, if you're 8 times more likely to live in poverty than your non-disabled peers, those are all disability issues. They're systemic. So ableism, when it creeps up in our society, is that assumption that disability issues are health issues, but disability is so much more.
I want to share an example. Go ahead, Alice, go ahead.
I also like to point out that ableism can be deadly. And, I'll just, bring up some examples that, there are quite a few cases of disabled people being murdered and abused, often by their caregiver. It may be an adult, it may be somebody at an institution, and often were really royals and really just, speaks to ableism. If you look at a lot of the media coverage for it, and very often the parents there's a lot of sympathy. There's always the focus on, oh, this caregiver, they just, they didn't have enough supports.
Right.
The stress, the burden of having a disabled family member.
I want to share.
And I think that speaks.
I hear you there. I just want to jump in here because I want to share an example that perhaps the stream participated in ableism, and you guys can tell me. So we put out that we're doing the show in the Twitter chat, and we got back this tweet. This is CCAC saying, "Is this just tweets, or will it be live video online with closed captioning?" Our show today does not feature closed captioning. It's not something we offer, but perhaps should have and should have thought of that. But it's not something that even crossed our minds. But Alyssa, you're nodding there. Lawrence looks like you want to jump in.
I was going to say
ahead.
congratulations. I think it's the first time I've ever done a television show where you've called yourself out. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Knowing there's a problem is the first step, right, in addressing it. I think when we're talking about the voting issue in particular, where does ableism creep in? Let's look at it specifically. I am the public affairs specialist at the National Council on Disability. We're the independent federal agency that recommends disability policy to the president, to Congress, and to other federal agencies. Our mandate is broad. We did a report in 2013 on the experience of voters in the 2012 election, and what we found that was 1 in 5 people were kept from casting a ballot privately and independently in ways that their non-disabled peers can take for granted. We found that more than half of the polling places, there were hurdles, obstacles in the polling places themselves toward casting that vote, and that 50% of the technology didn't work. So even if you got in there, you couldn't get the machine to work, or the poll worker didn't know how to use it. That's not even addressing the 40% of polls where people couldn't even get into the building. So if you can't get into the building to cast your vote, you can't be heard, and your issues are not going to be dealt with.
Right.
You know, you talk about, just very quickly, I'll come right back to you. No, I'll come right back to you. You talk about issues, whether it's accessibility or what have you. Lindsey Barron generally saying, unfortunately, we hear many reports from people denied accommodations and polling places lacking access in various ways. Now, that might be general, but we've had a lot of people, specifically referencing various incidents that have happened in many recent years. And one of these comments we got from Alec, where he's speaking about what happens when you don't actually have a physical disability, rather that's visual, or I should say a disability that's visual. Take a listen to what Alec said. We'll come right back to you.
Hello, my name is Alec Frazier, and I have autism as well as a number of other mental health diagnoses. My biggest concern with voting accessibility is what happens when you don't have a visible disability. I have been a disability election monitor for a few years with an independent living network, and I always try to make sure that voting is accessible, whether it's absentee or in person. I was told at one point that I did not need accessible voting because I am not visually impaired. Is there a way we can educate people that more than just the visually impaired need accessible voting, that disabled people can look like anyone, you and me?
That disabled people can look like anyone. Violet, I know you wanted to jump in earlier, but what do you make of that comment from Alec?
I think that's something very important. I know that here in South Carolina, we have various ways for people to vote that, to me, are accessible. I think that one of the key issues that he brings up is the education piece, that disability does not just look like somebody in a wheelchair, somebody who uses crutches. It can be invisible, and nobody's rights should be denied just because their disability cannot be seen visibly. So I really do think that there needs to be a push to provide better education and accommodations for those who may have disabilities that may challenge them, be a challenge to vote and not be discriminated against.
Valissa, it makes an excellent point. Currently, to the best of my understanding, there are 15 states, including Washington, D.C., that bar people from voting due to arbitrary notions of mental capacity, right? And no other constituency group, no other identity group has to put up with those tests. People would see that today as a violation of the Voting Rights Act, and we're not seeing that same standard being applied to disability.
I love that you brought that up, because actually this conversation is so big. We're actually doing 2 shows, and that is exactly what we're going to talk about in our second show. People with intellectual disabilities and how they are able or not so able to vote based on their state. But one of the things that you've all mentioned that reminds me of something we did this weekend of the Stream team is how you are able to vote with some of disabilities that either you can see or you can't see. What provisions are there for you? So in Washington, D.C., our producers went with someone who needed a little bit of help. Our producer followed someone named Jim Dixon and his seeing eye dog to the polls, and here's his experience.
Today I'm going to vote for President of the United States.
Mr. Dixon, here's the handheld device there. All right, and I'm going to begin the process.
People around the world who are disabled like me or who are illiterate will be able to use equipment like this so that they can vote secretly for the rulers who they want to have in office.
Donald J. Trump, Republican. Hillary Clinton, Democratic. You have some.
More and more people choose to vote by mail, and if I chose to vote by mail right now, I would have to have somebody else mark the ballot, and so we need research and development to make those systems accessible. I still get gooseflesh when I can vote secretly. Somebody as powerful as the President of the United States depends on my vote and the vote of other people to have the peaceful transference of power, because the people pick their leaders, is just a gift from God.
So Alice, the whole time we were watching that clip there, Alice was nodding along. Alice, what were you thinking as you watched him vote?
Yeah, well, it's really exciting, and I think this is another, aspect that, we encourage people to become politically active, because there has been this history of oppression for people with disabilities. I mean, only 100 years ago, somebody like myself would have been hidden away in an institution. So it's only recently, the last, 50, 60 years, people with disabilities have really come out and been integrated in our society, and that part of that is, involves voting. And I think one other aspect I wanted to jump in and bring up in terms of access is in terms of voter information. I think that so many voter guides, they're written, that the language is so dense,
right,
that even most average people take forever to go through their booklets. In California, I have my absentee ballots. I mean, it is really chock full of, propositions I have to read through. And we have to think about ways that we can make this information as, literate, as easy formats for all people to process that information. So that's another huge piece of accessibility that we don't often think about.
And Alice, I mean, there's so much that we don't think about, and as you were speaking, I couldn't help but notice, there's all this commentary coming in, people relating and relaying their personal stories. Jack Brandt wrote us and said, I think at the end of the day, the most important thing for people with disabilities in this election and after is to be involved in the process and to stay informed. I think maybe what he's also referring to is what you were touching on, knowing your rights. And of course, sometimes when you need help and maybe people can't help you, you rely on friends. That's what we all do, right? Don Schneider saying, I took a friend to early vote who asked if they could turn on the screen reading capability so he could hear the info. No one knew how. A poll worker tried to read him the ballot. Andrew, when you hear these things, I see some of them shaking their heads. What do you make of that? Is this?
Well, it kind of goes back to an earlier question you had about education, and it kind of indicates to me some of the type of education that goes on is very thin. They check the box. Yes, we educated people. They had a training, one afternoon, and that's better than nothing. But a lot of times you get this one-dimensional education. So if it wasn't exactly on the note page that they were given, to do it exactly this way, then nobody wants to do anything with it. And so any little unusual thing, and people kind of freak out. That's not uncommon, unfortunately.
So Lawrence, this is about people knowing their rights, but also about educating poll workers and other people who will be working on election day, because it's not just the poll workers.
That's right, and think about it, disability is the only minority that you can join in an instant.
Right.
Superman falls off the horse, he's in the club, right?
Right.
80% of those who are disabled become disabled later. It can be through an accident, it can be through war, you can have a child born with autism or Down syndrome. These issues are going to affect you, and if we don't address these issues now, if we don't guarantee accessibility now, one day it might be you who doesn't get to vote. So I think it's important to realize it's not just those disabled people out there, that it's actually all of us.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I mean, so many people really writing us, and I think this really speaks to maybe the fact that this is a topic that doesn't get discussed as often as it should, not just in the media, but here in America in general. Chelsea Hand saying, I know a friend whose disability disqualifies them from driving, and the bus he takes to town isn't running on election day. So many different stories like this. And again, since Malika, I want to bring one more to you. Don Schneider saying, we voted early due to my precinct being dangerously inaccessible. You must go down a steep loading dock ramp. I have complained for years, but nothing is done. They suggested I either vote early or absentee. So of course, that's probably not a long-term solution. It's not probably one that I would imagine any of you are happy with. Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, I mean, yes and no. I think one thing about it is, one of the things that I personally think is that type of flexibility of not having it always be just one day you can vote actually would help in a lot of things, because it's not just specific accessibility points. When you're disabled in some way, an ordinary errand is like taking a plane trip. You have to do that much planning and coordination of all these different moving pieces just to get to do a simple errand. And voting is like a simple errand. For most people, it's not a big deal. They hop in their car, they drive, a few blocks or part way across town, they go and they vote, they drive away. No biggie. For a lot of people with disabilities, they have to get buses, they have to arrange rides, they have to arrange a certain kind of ride, and if any piece of it falls apart, the whole operation is basically done.
I came to.
But if you had more ways to vote, more days to vote, more opportunities, then you would have more flexibility.
Options are always good, right? Giving people access points is always a good thing. I moved to Washington, D.C. to work for the council. Before that, I was in New York City. I know people in New York City that had to take 3 different buses. It took them 2 hours to get to the polling place. Then they'd have to vote, hope that the machine would work, hope that they could get in the building, and then it would take them 2 hours to get home. So we're talking maybe, if you're lucky, 5 hours out of your day to place your vote.
Portion of the day.
Nobody else would put up with that. I think if that was happening to any other community or identity group, there'd be marching in the streets, and for good reason. We're finally seeing disabled people flexing our muscles in quite the same way.
Alex flexing muscles. Go ahead. I know you wanted to jump in there. What do you make of that?
Sorry about that. Would you also see larger attempts to add voter IDs along waiting lines in various states in terms of voter suppression? And those also disproportionately impacts people with disabilities, with fewer polling places in various states, voter ID laws, they impact people with disabilities because it's a matter of, if there's a long lines, a lot of people with disabilities just won't have the energy and the stamina
If you don't drive, what ID do you have? What ID are you likely to have?
Yeah, so if you think about these larger issues of voter suppression and voter rights, it really does impact people with disabilities and older adults.
And I kind of want to just sneak one last comment in here. I think this might be a good one to wrap it up. Malika, Michelle in New York City writing back to us saying that, like every other human being, one thing we want people to know, we exist for ourselves, not to inspire others, not here for the pity.
I like that. We're out of time for this show, but that's a perfect way to end it. This discussion is far from over. Join part 2 of our conversation on disability in the U.S. election next time on The Stream.